And I just want to express my deep thanks to everyone who is here, because it's really true. The more people who show up at these reunions, the more memories are triggered, the more laughs are shared, and by far, a better time is had by all. And we have, by the way, a much better turnout than we had at the 35th, and I hope we have even more at the 45th. But when we think back on our years at Poly, we were there at a really unique moment in time. We were the first class ever to graduate women. And they're both here tonight, by the way. Martha Ricky Earhart, sorry, and Pamela Simmons Gooden, both here. Stand up. You guys made history.
Yes, indeed.
Meanwhile, in those years, City College's enrollment had dropped so precipitously in the years that we were at Poly that City wasn't even a viable option for students as it had been in the past and as it would be again later. So there were a lot of people at Poly who were there just because it was the best school in Baltimore, not necessarily because they wanted to study math or engineering. That never happened before or since. And that was a challenge for us and certainly a challenge for the administration. And we were talking about this at one of the last reunion planning meetings. When we got to Poly, as freshmen and sophomores, the seniors still wore slide rules on their belts. We never did. We were probably the first class that never wore slide rules on our belts. And another thing that happened, the Poly Follies in our senior year was the last Poly Follies ever, the end of a, I think, 55-year tradition. It was really a unique period in the school's history. It's fascinating to be in a place steeped in tradition at a time of rapid change. Mr. Griswold, M. Howell Griswold, who taught French and German, we remember Mr. Griswold. He was also a member of the class of 39 of Poly. He wrote the history of Poly, which he published in 1984, and I know a number of people in the room have that book. He wrote about the years that we were at Poly the following. It was obvious that change was taking place in traditional areas, but accepting change is the sign of maturity, and the Baltimore Polytechnic Institute had survived change in the past and tried to keep its head up, looking forward. But Mr. Griswold also quoted Thomas Paine saying, "These were the times that try men's souls." Pretty sure he had our class in mind when he was talking about that. But Poly's a very resilient institution. It's still there. It still represents excellence just as it did when we were there. And I think we'd all admit that it helped make us pretty resilient too. Poly taught us to work hard, to study, and to deal with adversity. It helped us to grow up. Now, I don't know firsthand if the students are still learning these things, but I bet they are. And here's what I do know for certain. A big part of who we have become is a direct result of what we learned at Poly. And we owe a lot to people like Mr. Molds and Ms. Erickson and Mr. Oshry and Mr. Kimmett, the list goes on. Mr. Griswold himself was the man who convinced me to wear a tie to school every day. I think every one of us can remember things our teachers taught us that stayed with us our whole lives. You know, we hear a lot these days about the importance of STEM education, science, technology, engineering, and math. And in the past 10 years or so, that's all we hear about with regard to government, the educational system, and trying to increase the emphasis on STEM education. Well, as we know, we were STEM, and Poly was STEM before STEM was cool. Poly was way ahead of the times in that respect. On the other hand, I still kind of think, and I definitely thought when I was at Poly, that the administration of the school envisioned the life and career of the typical Poly student as sitting at a big table drawing globe valves and making pretty little arrowheads, or pouring molten metal into a sand mold. That's not how most of us turned out. We did hundreds of different things. Many of us have multiple careers. We've gone in 500 different directions, but we all have one thing in common, and that's Polly. You know, in 2016, people feel pretty separated and polarized. The political season is as heated as any in memory. Here in Baltimore, where I live, and in other parts of the country, we've had unrest that strains our very sense of community. But it is institutions like Polly, institutions we love, that bring us together and keep us together. And for that, for belonging to Polly, we should also be grateful. And I want to tell you one story, and then I'll be quiet and let somebody else talk. But the story captures, I think, how Polly has influenced people through the years. Not long ago, I met an older retired man in a business setting on the Lower Eastern Shore of Maryland. Neither one of us in this meeting knew where the other was from. And he was pretty old, and he was suffering from Parkinson's disease. So the conversing with him was a little bit difficult, but he was very kind, and we were having a very nice meeting. And right in the middle of the meeting, right in the middle of a discussion about personal finance, he began to talk about his high school, which he didn't name. But he said the principal there spoke of 6 words to live by: freedom, responsibility, goodness, mercy, perseverance, and achievement. He said it right off the top of his head. I was absolutely speechless. Yes, he was a Polly man, and he was quoting Dr. DeHuff's 6 words to live by. I almost fell off my chair. All I could say was, that's my high school too, and it still is, and it always will be. Go Polly.